Now, hello students. Now we are going to move on to the next movement, that is horizontal movement. Now, what is horizontal movement? Horizontal movement is called orogenic movement. Now, horizontal movement, these movements work in horizontal direction. As per the direction, these movements produce compression or tension in the rock strata. These movements lead to either folds or cracks. There are folds building up or there are cracks taking place in the surface of the earth. These movements give rise to mountains. These movements are also slow movements, but their speed is more than the continental building movements. Their speed is more than the continental building movements, that is vertical movements or epidermic movements, and their extent is also lesser. Their spread is also less as compared to the vertical movements. These movements produce either folds or faults. Consequently, either fold mountains or block mountains are formed. So what kind of two types of mountains which are formed in horizontal movements? Block mountains and fold mountains. Now these two concepts I will be teaching more in detail in my later lectures. They are also called mountain building processes. These forces are further divided into two types. Now, before I finish this, we are doing a quick recap of what was vertical movements. Vertical movements originate from the center of the earth and affect its surface. Consequently, large-scale uplift or subsidence of a part, sinking of a part's earth's surface takes place. These movements are slow and widespread. In the first lecture, we got to know about vertical movements, that they are slow and widespread and they do not bring changes in the horizontal rock strata. These movements are mainly associated with the formations of continents and plateaus, because vertical movements are also called uh, continent building continent building movements. Hence, these are also known as continent building or plateau building movements. These are also called epigenetic movements. Sedimentary rocks. What kind of rocks are deposited? Sedimentary rocks are deposited and formed in the oceans and seas. The presence of these sedimentary rocks is widespread in continents. So what kind of rocks do we find? Sedimentary rocks in continents. These clearly show that these were uplifted or raised to form continents. Now, horizontal movements we are going to try and understand. This was a recap of vertical movements. Now, horizontal movements, what are they? They act on the Earth's crust from side to side, that is horizontally or tangentially. These words you'll have to keep in mind. How do they rise? They rise or they act from side to side or horizontally. They cause a lot of disruption in the horizontal layer of strata. And horizontal movements are also called what? Orogenic movements. They cause a lot of disruption in the horizontal layer of strata. They are known as horizontal or tangential movements. Now these can be divided into two types: forces of compression or forces of tension. These two words are going to be used quite a few times. Forces of compression. What does this involve? It involves pushing of the rock against a hard plane from one side or from both sides. It's either been hit hardly from one side or from both sides. So the compressional forces lead to the bending of rock layers and thus lead to the formation of fold mountains. Now we got to know, when as I read out from page 2, horizontal movement, what two kinds of formations, mountains are formed in horizontal movements or through horizontal movements? Fold mountains and block mountains. So what happens? How are they formed? Fold mountains, how are they formed? The compressional forces lead to the bending of rock layers, and thus over here, when there's bending of rocks happening, fold mountains are formed. In them, the rock strata, primarily of the sedimentary rocks, gets folded into wave-like structure. You'll have seen waves, whether it's tidal waves or oceanic waves. What are they? So that way, they look like that. In them, the rock strata, primarily of sedimentary rocks, gets folded into wave-like structure. When folding takes place on a gigantic scale, on a huge scale, it represents the mountain building process. Most of the great mountain chains of the world, that's the Himalayas, the Rockies, the Andes, the Alps, and others of this sort, have been formed by compressional forces resulting in mountain building on a large scale. These are also called orogenetic movements. As vertical movements have two more names, that's um, continental building and epeirogenic. Over here also there are two names, orogenic and tangential movements. So these are the two, they are one and the same, but they have two names each. Forces of tension. Now forces of tension are produced when these forces are working horizontally in opposite directions. That is, they move away from a given plane or point. They are moving away from one another. You understand the difference? Forces of compression, what are they? Forces of compression is what? Pushing against the hard plane from one side or both sides. And over here, when there's tension taking place, they move in opposite directions. That is, move away from a given plane or point. Under the operation of intense, very serious tensional forces, the rock strata are broken or fractured. As a result, cracks and fractures develop. Now, due to this pressure, what happens? There are cracks and fractures because they are broken and fractured. The displacement of rocks upward or downward from their original position. Upward is uplifting, downward is going down, moving down from their original position. Either ways, along such a fracture is termed as faulting. It is termed as faulting. Now, mind you, students, whether it's folding, faulting, this all we are going to study more in detail. So now we have to just understand that what happens. This is a very important section where you'll need to understand what is tensional force or compressional force. What does this exactly mean? So the displacement of rocks, whether it's happening upwards or downwards from their original position because of a fracture or due to a fracture or being broke, is termed as faulting. And folding, what did we see? What was folding? Forces which lead to bending of rock layers leads to formation of fold mountains. The line along which displacement of the fractured rock strata takes place is called the fault line. So the line along which displacement of the fractured rock strata takes place is called the fault line, from where it begins. Likewise, the plane along which the displacement of rock strata takes place is known as fault plane. Faulting results in the formation of well-known relief features such as rift valleys and block mountains. Now, with faulting, what happens? There are two more formations which happen, or relief features which take place. That's the rift valleys and block mountains. You all have done this in your previous classes. So you all have to understand what comes under folding category and faulting category. So faulting results in the formation of well-known relief in the formation of features such as rift valleys and block mountains. Now over here there's a small introduction. I'm just reading out to you. We will do it later more in detail. A rift valley is formed by sinking of rock strata lying between two almost parallel faults. So between two fault lines or fault planes, the sinking rock strata is called a rift valley. That's what they mean to say. The classical examples of rift valleys in the world include Midland Valley of Scotland, the Rhine Valley, the Valley of Nile, Dead Sea Basin, the Great Rift Valley of East Africa, comprising few lakes of this region. Now, all these examples you all have come across in your textbooks for time and again for some reason or the other. So all these, I'm sure you'll know about the Dead Sea, the Great Rift Valley also, Rhine Valley also. These are very common, important examples in geographical terms or concepts which refer to these movements or different kinds of valleys when you'll study, or the water bodies you'll study, or the land formations you'll study. Some geographers are of the opinion that the Narmada and Tapti valleys are also rift valleys. They are also rift valleys. We have learned about Narmada, we know about Tapti, we've heard of those. The coal deposits of the Damodar Valley are said to be originally laid in synclinal trough resembling a rift valley. This is another example where Damodar Valley is basically known for its coal deposits. Now, what is a rift valley? What are they trying to tell us? A rift valley is a trough. I will be telling you about a trough. Try to just understand what it's trying to say. With steep, means very deep, parallel walls along the fault lines. I repeat, a rift valley is a trough with steep parallel walls along the fault lines. Such a valley is also called a graben. So there's another name for valleys which are steep as against parallel walls along the fault lines are also called grabens. A rift valley may also be formed by, there's another way also of a rift valley being formed. A rift valley may also be formed by upliftment of two blocks along the fault line. These uplifted blocks means going upwards, rising above. Uplifted means they are rising. Blocks are called hosts or block mountains. Now, block mountains are also called horsts or also called block mountains. And parallel walls which are steep along the fault lines are also called rift valleys or grabens. The well-known examples of horsts are the Vosges and the Black Forest Mountains on both sides of Rhine Rift Valley and the plateaus of Palestine and Transjordan. Now these are again examples which you are well versed with. The escarpments are the characteristic features of rift valleys and horsts. They are very steep or having highly precipitous slopes in a continuous line facing one direction. So they are steep as well as highly precipitous slopes which are facing only in one direction. The escarpments of Western Ghats, once looking the Arabian Sea, are thought to be the result of faulting. Now these are various examples given. Where do you find these faulting mountains, folding movements, all of those. The escarpments of Vindhyachal mountain are also ascribed to be faulting and formation of narrow Narmada valley. So these are perfect examples. You all can look out for these examples for images or pictures. If I can get them through, I will surely show it. Now you all can see this diagrammatic form of diverging, converging. In the previous lecture, I had told you all how diversion happens, converging, and how does transformation happen. So this is just a figure to understand it in a diagrammatic form. Now, basically, we are talking about Earth's movements, and here also we are talking about the different how are mountains formed. So sometimes under current conditions, plate movements cause the crust to fold. I explained to you all about what is plates, what is a crust, what is a continental crust, I repeat. It is the outermost layer of Earth's lithosphere that makes up the planet's continents and continental shelves. Folds are bends in rock. The folds, what you all see, are the bends in rock. So bending of rock leads to folding in rocks that form when compression shortens and thickens part of Earth's crust. So there's some activity happening, internal activity happening. Compression takes place. It shortens and thickens the part of the Earth's crust where the bends take place. Folds can be microscopic or huge. The Appalachian Mountains, I repeat it again, the Appalachian Mountains are formed from folds. Some folds are hidden underneath other layers of rocks and hills. Now, if you Google search Appalachian Mountains, they are fold mountains. And how are they formed? You can actually see the folds. Some folds can be seen, some folds are microscopic or some are huge. They are hidden underneath other layers of rocks and hills. These plate collisions is like they are banging against one another. They are colliding with one another. Can produce earthquakes. Now, earthquakes is a sudden movement, and what we are learning now is horizontal movement, which comes under the category of slow movements, also known as tectonic movements. So these plate collisions can produce earthquakes because rock folding can fracture and lead to faults. Now, here again I repeat, I'm every time going to come across these words for you all to better get it into your minds and understand these concepts very nicely. There are two types of vertical movements, uplift and subsidence. The rising of the regions, look at the figure next to uplift. The rising of regions or Earth's crust to higher elevations, to greater heights, elevated, heightened. The rising of regions or Earth's crust to higher elevations. Subsidence, the sinking of regions of Earth's crust to lower elevations. It's sinking, it's going downwards. The slope goes downwards. Now, tension. What are we talking about tension? When we talk about tension, tension pulls on the rocks, causing them to stretch out. So in tension, what happens? The rocks stretch out. This causes the rocks to be thinner, so they increase in volume but decrease in density. Now look at figure A and understand what is it saying. Before stress, how does the rock look? And when there is some tension, there's some pulling out, there's some stretching out. So what happens at that time? The rock becomes thinner so that it increases in volume and it decreases in density. Tension, it's another form of stress, is tension. Another form of stress is tension. Tension is the stress that occurs when forces stretch an object. Look at the first small figure where there are two arrows shown to the left and right, you can see over there in between it's sinking, and from the left and right it's somewhere stretching out both sides. They occur at divergent boundaries. And some time back I showed you all what is divergent. How does divergent look? This is the way divergent looks. So they are diverging. Tension is the stress that occurs when forces stretch an object. They occur at divergent boundaries, the mid-ocean ridges. Now, tensional forces. On page 2, what does our lesson tell us, our textbook tell us? When the forces move away from each other, I'm stressing out on certain lines or words so that you all keep those words in mind. When the word forces move away from each other and cause stress in the rock strata. Figure 1.2 I will show you all. This process creates ruptures, cracks, fractures and faults in the rock strata. This leads to crustal fracture. Look at this figure 1.2 and the formation of faults. Rift valleys or block mountains are formed as a result of these forces. I read out to you all about rift valleys and block mountains. So they are formed due to which forces? Tensional forces. And if you look at the figure, tensional forces, how does it happen? Look at the first half of it and look at the second half of it. They are moving away. They move away from each other and they cause stress. And because of that, there is tension, there is crack, there is fracture, and there are faults. Compressional forces. Now coming on to compressional forces. When the forces operate towards each other, they cause compression. When the forces operate towards each other, they cause compression. They're coming closer. And hence they are called converging or compressional forces. Look at figure 1.3. These movements cause various types of folding. The first half and second half you all can easily identify. These forces cause pressure on the layer of rocks. What happens? There's pressure building up on these rocks. This leads to folding and faulting of the surface. We'll try to understand more about compression. Now, compression occurs when the rocks are pushed together. When the rocks are pushed together, causes the rocks to become more denser and smaller in volume. It puts so much pressure that the rock becomes denser and smaller. The rocks are pushed higher up and deeper down. They are pushed higher up and deeper down. Now we come to folding. The nature of folding that occurs on the Earth's surface depends on many factors. These include the nature of rocks. What kind of rocks? What is their nature? What is their characteristics? The intensity and the duration of force. Soft and elastic rocks are affected more by these forces. If the rock is very soft and elastic in nature, so they get affected by folding. When energy waves move through the layers of rocks on a large scale, they can be divided. Again, I am talking about forces of compression before I move on to folding. What is forces of compression? I repeat, it involves pushing of the rock strata against a hard plane from one side or from both sides. The compressional force leads to bending of rocks layers and thus forms fold mountains. So fold mountains are formed due to compression. Block mountains are formed due to tensional force. In them, the rock strata, primarily of the sedimentary rocks, gets folded into wave-like structure. There are waves. When folding takes place on a gigantic scale, it represents the mountain building process. When folding takes place on a huge scale, gigantic scale, it represents the mountain building process. So now I come back to folding. Soft and elastic rocks are affected more by these forces. When energy waves move through the layers of rocks on a large scale, folds are formed. Now in this lecture, in this class, what did we try to understand? What are the two types of forces? What is horizontal movement? The horizontal movements are also called orogenic movements. They work in which direction? They work in horizontal direction. They produce compression or tension. Horizontal movements produce what kind of forces, movements? Compression and tension. We try to understand what compression means and tension means. These movements are also called mountain building processes, and they basically are divided into two forces. Which were the two forces which we learned? Tensional force and compressional force. Tensional force is when the force moves away from each other and causes stress. In tension, the forces move away from each other and there is a lot of stress and pressure, due to which what happens? Ruptures, cracks, fractures and faults takes place. Over here, which two formations takes place due to tensional force? Always keep in mind, you all can get an MCQ or a question relating or fill in the blank or whatever. What due to tensional forces, what kind of formations are there? Rift valleys and block mountains. Moving on to the second force that we learned was compressional. They operate towards each other. I repeat, these are the forces which operate towards each other. What do? They cause compression and they are called compressional force. Now they cause various types of folding. These forces cause pressure on the layer of rocks. And this leads to what? This leads to folding and faulting. So tension, block mountains and rift valleys are formed. Through compressional force, what is formed? What is formed? Folding and faulting. Folding we've just begun with. The nature of folding that occurs on the Earth's surface depends on many factors. It's not restricted to one factor. The nature of the rocks, the intensity and the force. Now who's affected by these forces? Soft and elastic rocks. When the energy waves move through the layers of rocks on a large scale, folds are formed. So here we've just introduced ourselves to the topic of folding. Lecture 3, we will be learning more about folding and it is a part of compressional force.